We aren't going to talk about the $1,400, but we definitely going to talk about the stimulus. Who came up with the name Stimmy anyway? Like, we couldn't come up with a better name for it. But before we dive in, if you're interested in following my debt-free journey and learning about finance, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and definitely hit that like button because it'll help the channel grow. We aren't going to talk about the $1,400 stimulus. Only thing I advise you to do is don't give it to that friend who think they're going to flip it for you, because if they didn't flip the $600 check good, they definitely wouldn't. Don't trust them with this one. Since this $1.9 trillion relief package was passed, a lot of Americans are getting much needed relief in areas of their life where they need relief. What we're going to talk about in this video is how this stimulus package that was approved, how it impacts student loans. So let's go through the timeline of events. On February 4th, House Democrats introduced a proposal, and essentially this resolution called for President Biden to cancel $50,000 of federal student loans immediately through an executive order. Fast forward, February 16th, President Biden during the town hall, I talked about it in another video, the young lady asked him, hey, what are you going to do to cancel $50,000? Biden essentially said, I'm not going to cancel $50,000, I'll do $10,000, but I don't think I can do $50,000 because I don't have the authority to do it. Now, I'm an attorney by trade. I've been practicing for well over a decade. I know I got a baby face, but I'm up there. So I've been practicing for well over a decade, but I'm not your attorney, but I am an attorney. And so a lot of times when I see these conversations going on, a lot of people say, oh, well, he don't have the authority to do it. I can just give you my legal opinion on what I read. A lot of people, it's in the Higher Education Act. The Higher Education Act authorizes the Secretary of Education or the executive branch to cancel any student loan debt. So essentially, the way that I interpret it from when I read it, and there are 17 attorney generals who actually reached out to the Biden administration on February 19th who agree with this interpretation because it's clear, it's written in simple plain English. The executive and the Secretary of Education has the authority to cancel student loan debt. They don't put a dollar amount on it. The dollar amount is put on there by President Biden. He's the one who came up with this number, $10,000. And nowhere in the Higher Education Act is there a number that expressly says $10,000. I'm just putting that out there regardless of what my personal opinions on student loan forgiveness, but that's what the Higher Education Act says. So if we read it literally, essentially he has the option to forgive all of it or whatever he wants or nothing, but there's no dollar amount set on it. It's really up to the Secretary of Education and the executive branch boss, who is the President of the United States. So let's get that out there first. The $10,000 isn't anything that's mandated by the Higher Education Act. That's a number that Biden is putting on there, but you won't find any legislation out there that says, nothing nowhere that says he can only do $10,000. That's first and foremost. Okay, so fast forward, on March 11th, American Rescue Plan was passed into law. This was the stimulus that gave all these great and outstanding benefits. But this stimulus did have some language that relates to student loans. Now, in some older student loan videos that I did, I won't even link those videos because you can find them if you want to look at them. But I'll just go through a brief summary now. But in some older student loan videos, I explained how student loan forgiveness works. Essentially, if you have $10,000 of student loan forgiveness, and the government says, okay, you completed your public service student loan forgiveness requirements and we are going to forgive $10,000, you will be obligated to pay federal taxes on that amount that was forgiven. Now, the reason why that is because how the IRS in the federal statute defines gross income. Gross income is essentially any monetary benefit derived from any source of any kind. So what that means is if they forgive $10,000, that's as if you received $10,000, that counts as gross income and you're going to have to be taxed on it. So that's how taxes and student loan forgiveness currently work. But because of Senator Elizabeth Warren, she actually made a push to include specific language in this stimulus package that lays a great blueprint and foundation to protect individuals from having to pay taxes on student loans that are canceled, between now and 2025. If ever the government decides to cancel federal student loans, and this is either through an executive action through Congress, or if they decide to increase and make student loan forgiveness programs easier for people to qualify, and any loans that will be forgiven, you won't have to pay taxes on them. So they definitely laid down a great framework. So if student loans are forgiven in any capacity, you won't have to pay taxes on what was forgiven. Now let's talk a little bit about how this comes into play. I'm going to just scroll through my notes here because I don't want to memorize it. Okay, so essentially the process of how student loan forgiveness legislation would work if it comes down the pike. Now we already know that President Biden is on the record 50,000 times saying that he's going to call on Congress to forgive across the board $10,000. So if he's calling on Congress to do it, we have a little bit of congressional procedural talk that we're going to have to talk about so we can see how this could get done, or we can evaluate the likelihood that it will actually get done. So if President Biden is going to call on Congress to do it, he's going to need a majority of people in the Senate to vote on it. Typically 60 votes is what will get you there. However, they do have this process called reconciliation. Now what reconciliation is essentially a vehicle that's used for federal budgets. Anytime there's legislation that's done that can impact the federal budget, the federal debt, reconciliation can be used. And if reconciliation is used, you only need 51 votes in the Senate to push it through. So if Biden introduces any legislation for student loan forgiveness, if it goes through what's the traditional budgetary process and they try to use reconciliation, it will require 51 votes to move forward. If he pushes it through and it just goes through the normal legislative process, it's going to require 60 votes, which likely President Biden wouldn't be able to secure 60 votes to do any type of student loan forgiveness. Now with reconciliation, this really can only happen like twice a year when there are talks with regard to the budget. So normally reconciliation happens at the beginning of the fiscal year in September when they're working on a budget, and then at the end of the fiscal year. So if it does come up in reconciliation, the Senate will need, in the House, I think it'll pass. That's not even an issue because the Democrats have more control. In the Senate is where the issue is going to come in. They would need 51 votes. Unfortunately, they don't have 51 votes to actually get it done. Now, the other procedural thing you have to understand is the role of the parliamentarian. And to use this, let's talk about the quick example of $15 hour of minimum wage. The parliamentarian essentially just issues an advisory opinion. Based on my opinion, I don't think that $15 hour minimum wage actually impacts the budget or the national debt, so I don't think we can add it to and vote on it in the reconciliation process with 51 votes. That was a recommendation by the parliamentarian. Now, do they have to accept this recommendation? No. All it required was the president of the Senate to override that advisory opinion. So Vice President Harris could have easily said, hey, we're going to override it. We're going to put that $15 an hour minimum wage provision in this reconciliated budget bill. And then they pass it with 50 votes. Vice President Harris would have broke the tie and we would have had $15 an hour federal minimum wage. That's exactly how the situation will work if during that budget process near the end of the fiscal year, if the idea was to try to put student loan forgiveness into a budget bill and use it through the reconciliation process, I would probably guarantee that in that particular instance, you may have another situation where the parliamentarian issues an advisory opinion, and then the ball is essentially going to be in the administration's court and President Biden's administrative court if he wants Vice President Harris to actually vote to override that advisory opinion. So what I do expect to happen is that they'll make the public student loan forgiveness program a lot easier for people to qualify and for them to get loans forgiven through that program. So I think that's going to be the first thing. I know one of the changes that they talked about was actually making a sweeping change at one point where for every year of public service that a person do, $10,000 of their debt of student loan is removed up until 5 years, and the maximum could be $50,000. So I do think that there will be some efforts to adjust and make the public student loan forgiveness program a lot easier. I also think that somehow, some way, $10,000 student loan forgiveness only for federal student loans and only for student borrowers will find its way to make it in some sort of legislation. Now, I will tell you that I am expecting very favorable treatment with the student loan forbearance and the freeze on interest rates and not having to make any payments. Just the other day, Jerome Powell gave a speech, and every time he talked, the stock market goes down. But I digress. But just the other day, Jerome Powell gave a speech where he expressly addressed inflation. There's a lot of fear of inflation, which is causing a lot of volatility in the stock market. So, essentially what Jerome Powell said in that speech that I think is indicative and may be a correlation to the student loan payment and interest freeze being extended is that the Fed's plan to keep interest rates at record lows until at least 2023. So I think just from a common sense approach, as long as interest rates are down really because we're going through the pandemic. There's a hardship. They're trying to make sure and keep inflation under control. There was a relationship between the reduction of interest rates and the federal student loan interest rate freeze and forbearance on making payments. So I do think that so long as we have these record low interest rates, I think that the Biden administration will really be favorable towards keeping these interest rates low, freezing interest rates on student loans, and saying that no payments have to be made until we can navigate our way essentially through this pandemic. So that's where we are right now. And the other thing is, I think it would be really foolish to make people start paying back their student loans prior to the midterm elections. I mean, I just think that from a common sense standpoint, that'll be a bad look. So that's really where we are. That's what this stimulus package had in it that actually impacted student loans. And that's just kind of my opinion on where I think we are with student loans moving forward. I appreciate you all tuning in. Y'all take care. Be blessed. Peace.